So I'm going to start with a slide that's blatantly wrong. This is a sample size of 10 people. Can anybody tell me what's wrong with this slide? Go for it. Well, other than the fact that it's a small sample size. They are all guys. Go ahead. There we go. Everybody thinks they're above average. Except for the last guy. So if we put this on a normal distribution curve, everybody thinks they're above average. So some scientists, Dunning and Kruger, and I'm sure most of you guys have heard of them, talk about this effect where when we're novices at something, we think we're really awesome at it, and our confidence is really high. And as we start digging into something, we start to learn that it's a little bit more complicated than we thought, until we reach expert, where the answer is, trust me, it's complicated. So I wanted to talk, starting in 2011, Eric Ries came out with Lean Startup. I'm sure all of you are very familiar with it. And what Eric Ries and Steve Blank said was, get out of the building, talk to your customers. And if you're anything like me, I thought, just like the Dunning-Kruger effect, I'm great at getting customer feedback. I ask for feedback all the time. I ask people, do you like what I'm wearing? Can you read my paper and tell me what you think of it? So I thought, asking customers for feedback, no problem. So I've talked to a lot of companies, and I've seen this kind of whiplash effect over the last couple of years, where people have moved from saying, hey, I'm going to go talk to my customers, to people are quoting, Henry Ford did not actually say, by the way, that if I asked my customers, they would tell me to build a faster horse. But that's typically what you would hear people saying when they're talking about, I do listen to my customers, but I'm really just going to go out and innovate and go with my gut. And what I'm going to talk about today is something in the middle. Something where we can listen to customers in a way that cuts through the noise, right? Because I'm sure all of you get feedback from your customers. And it's this huge pile of information. So how do we sort through it? And I also wanted to say, it's not isolated to startups. So I'm going to tell you a couple of stories about big companies that have had some feedback fails first. So I'm going to take us back to the 90s. When McDonald's spent a large portion of a $300 million research budget on what they're calling the burger with the grown-up taste. And I'm sure if you guys have read a bunch of case studies, this is the Arch Deluxe. So McDonald's asked their customers, what kind of burger do you want? And they said they wanted a fancy burger like the one you would see at a typical hipster restaurant these days. And the Arch Deluxe was actually a big flop. It didn't last very long on the menu. The next one is my favorite, personally. Mattel went out and they asked little girls, what would you like to improve about Ken? So the Pigtail Squad said, we want him to be really cool. And this was what Mattel interpreted as really cool. By the way, this is now a kitsch memorabilia item, if you look for it online. It's called Earring Magic Ken. So, as you can see, interpreting feedback sometimes is really difficult, right? What one person's definition of cool, like a 7-year-old, is going to be very different from a 40-year-old exec working at Mattel. I'm betting a lot of people in this room remember Facebook Home. Or if you don't, that's because it didn't last very long. Facebook went out, they did lots of customer research. You can actually find articles about all the customer research that they did. They did case studies, they did diary studies, they did tons of research. A lot of it was actually done on their own employees, which may have contributed to the fact that they didn't gather some information that was really important, which was that when people got Facebook Home on their phone, it was something that was kind of omnipresent on their phone. they felt like it was too invasive. It was too in their face. And it was shut down pretty quickly. So Facebook Home is another example of a startup that asked for feedback, they listened, and they got it wrong. So that's why I bring up the Henry Ford example a minute ago, because so many companies have kind of moved in the opposite direction of saying, we're not going to ask customers, we're just going to go out and launch it. So the obvious thing here is most feedback can't be taken at face value. And we're laughing at the stories of product fails. But what I'm going to talk about a little bit more is that some of the reasons why it can't be taken at face value. So I'm going to show you some funny pieces of feedback online. These are some old examples, but this guy's saying, hey, Domino's, I ordered pizza and it came in the toppings, it's just bread. And Domino's starts to react, and then they say, hey, I opened my pizza upside down. Oops. This guy gave a butterfly conservatory 1 star because you should only go if you like butterflies. And this is an Amazon review of a banana slicer. It's crazy, right? And I'm sure you guys have seen feedback like this, where you're looking at feedback and you're like, are we talking about the same thing? And scientists have actually shown that we're unreliable sources. So this was a study done in the mid-'70s by 2 scientists called Wilson and Nisbet. And what they did was they lined up 4 pairs of stockings. And they asked customers to come in and tell them which pair they liked the best. So people, are looking at these stockings and they're saying, I like the way that they stretch. I love the quality. The knit is phenomenal. And what they found was that people preferred this 1 pair of stockings. And it was the pair of stockings on the right. You know there's a catch, right? The catch was all 4 stockings were the same pair of stockings. And not a single person named the position of the stockings as the reason why they chose them. So sometimes, I don't say this is malice on anybody's part to come out and say, like, these are my favorite pair. It's just that we think about things and we don't know the reason why sometimes. Another study was done on jam. So they had some experts at Consumer Reports rate a bunch of jams. They had half the people taste the jam, rate it. The other half, they had taste it and give their reasons why their ratings were what they were. And what they saw is that people started rating jams like, if you've ever been to a wine or beer tasting, when people say, it tastes a little chalky or it has this wonderful sweet flavor, and they're evaluating the jam like providing lots of detail. The interesting thing is that when they asked people to justify their choice, the people who created these elaborate descriptions of the jam were actually much further away from what the experts at Consumer Reports rated. The first group, who just rated them, were pretty much on target with the Consumer Reports rating. So when you're asking people, and they're starting to invent reasons, their rational brain starts to take over rather than their emotional one. And the emotional one's the one that makes decisions. This is another study that shows something very similar. Scientists at UVA put out a free poster bin, and they let students pick a free poster that they could take home with them. Half the students, they just said, pick any poster. The other half had to rationalize it. When people picked a poster, the first group, who weren't asked to provide any more details, they typically picked Impressionist paintings, so like prints of Impressionist paintings. The second group, who were asked to rationalize it, chose funny animal posters. And the interesting thing was when they were asked a month later, how happy are you with the poster you picked? The people who chose the Impressionist paintings were overwhelmingly happy, while the people who chose the animal posters weren't. And that's another example of basically, it's really easy to describe why you think this funny animal poster would be a cool thing. And it's a lot harder to talk about why this abstract painting touched you. So it's interesting that when you ask people these things, sometimes they tell you things that maybe aren't completely accurate. So I've told you a lot of stories about why feedback could be dangerous. And I've already said, I'm not an advocate of going in the other direction and saying, hey, I'm just going to go out and work on my idea, and I think it's going to be the best idea, and I'm not going to ask anybody for any feedback at all. I think that there's an approach and a way that you can go out, collect feedback, and sort through it in a way that's actually really useful, and will provide something that is a better product overall. So the first thing I wanted to talk about here is that I hear a lot of people talk about this idea of the vocal minority, which are, these are your really loud customers, but maybe they don't represent a large portion of your customer base. They might be a small group, maybe they're your freemium customers, right? I heard Bubble talking earlier about, we have some smaller customers and we have large customers. Maybe your smaller customers are the ones that are very vocal, but they don't represent your large customers. So it's important to think about the vocal minority when we're thinking about collecting feedback and who they are. Maybe they do represent some of the needs of the silent majority, the people who aren't talking, but they are a large portion of your customer base. And that's something that's really important to think about and to test. So I think I'm going to take us back to the 3rd grade when I start breaking this down. I'm sure all of you have heard the 5 W's. Who, what, where, when, why. And it's really important when we're considering that mountain of feedback you guys are getting. I'm sure you're getting reviews, you're hearing it from your sales team or your customer success team. So how do we break this down so that we can interpret it in a way that's useful? And the first thing is something I just alluded to, which is who's providing the feedback. Is this your number 1 customer? Is this the person who's paying your bills right now? Or are these smaller customers who haven't even converted to paying yet? Are they new customers? Has something changed in the last couple of months? Maybe your onboarding has changed. Maybe the way that you're positioning yourself on your website has changed. Or are they your old loyal customers? And then you have to ask yourself, really, what has changed that these old loyal customers are now providing us with a lot of feedback? And the second thing I'm going to stick on for a little bit longer, which is, what's the goal? What are they trying to accomplish? And a lot of times I like to think of this through the jobs to be done framework, and I'm not going to get into jobs to be done, but if you want to look it up, take a look at Clay Christensen and Tony Ulwick's work. But the biggest takeaway from that is, what job are your customers trying to do, and how can you facilitate them getting there? So when I'm thinking about this, a lot of times what I'm thinking about is that end goal, that job they're trying to accomplish. And how do we reduce the friction that stands in their path to getting there, right? Those might be usability problems, or they might be that we're solving the wrong problem for them altogether. And how do we help them make progress towards that end goal? How do we accelerate them so that they're able to get there faster? They're more excited about it. So I'm going to talk a little bit about friction and how to break that down. So what slows down their progress? A lot of times I break this down, and this is a framework I actually created for when I'm working with customers and collecting customer feedback through customer research. So what I'm looking for are struggles. What are things that they run into all the time? This may be something that's confusing. A lot of times these are usability problems. It's something that they would encounter over and over again that might cause a problem. One example for a proper clause case may be checkout. Maybe checkout is confusing. I'm not saying that about them, but for any e-commerce company, right? Or they have difficulty finding something in the app. And the reason, I want to back up, the reason that I do break it down this way is sometimes it alludes to what the solution might be. Oh, it's no problem. That's cool.
My file, apparently I sat on my keys.
Oh, you know what? I do that all the time. It's really annoying. Sometimes it's in my bag too, and I'm like digging around for it. It's cool. No worries. So struggles. They're things that people run into over and over again that might impede them from making progress. Lapses. So lapses are reasons why people might leave the app, forget about it, and not come back. A lot of times you would solve these through notifications. I would check out, if you want to look into more about notifications and hot triggers and all that stuff, take a look at the work of BJ Fogg. But lapses are reasons why people might leave and not come back. The third thing are obstacles. So what are things that are in their path? This is usually during onboarding, the first time they use you, or the early stages of setup. These are one time, I like to think of them as like a boulder sitting in the middle of a road. They're things that prevent them from signing up, from activating, so from using the product regularly. There are things that once you solve them, you can usually get people into the product and using it. And the fourth is workarounds. So these are reasons why, I mean, if you've ever seen somebody use a dashboard and they're copying and pasting data into Excel, they're calculating it, and then they're going back to the dashboard, it's a classic workaround. There are reasons why people leave your application to do something else, and then they come back. So they're doing a completely different workflow outside of the app in order to accomplish what they need to get done. All right, so that's the what. So when you're thinking about what, think about what frictions in their path, well, what they're trying to accomplish, what frictions in their path, and how you can help them make progress towards that goal. The next W is when. So when did they provide the feedback? Is this early? Is this their first time using the product? Or is this something that they're doing much later? They're a loyal customer, they've been using you for a long time. It's really important to understand the stage that they're in when they're providing feedback, because it provides that context around where the problem might be. And the last piece is where. So where was this feedback? Where's this feedback from? Is it from a survey? Sometimes surveys don't provide you with context. People are just entering in information, right? Is it from, are you getting this from your sales team? Are they hearing this over and over again? They're bringing you stories of like, hey, this is impeding our sales. We need to fix this. Is it coming from your customer success team? It's just something to think about. The more information you can get around what the feedback really is about, the better. So I talked about kind of some of these things surrounding feedback where you can start sorting through it, start thinking about just through that lens of the 5 W's. And I didn't get into why. That's a talk for a whole different talk about motivation. So I'm not going to get into it today. But as you're starting to think about these things, you're naturally going to start coming up with potential solutions and start thinking about ways that things might be able to be fixed and tweaked. So as you're thinking about it, one thing that I like to bring up is what people do provides that context around what they say, right? It's the actions speak louder than words idea. That you saw in those studies, right? People will just say things, and it's not for any reason other than they aren't sure. So watching them actually interact with something is so much more valuable than listening to them tell you what they think you should do for the next 6 months and what your product roadmap should be. So what I typically recommend is creating a lifelike prototype of your idea, the thing that you think would solve this problem. And I'm not saying to code it or to make it. Get as close to lifelike as you can, as cheaply as possible. I've seen a lot of people do paper sketches and things like that. Often I would say a little bit higher fidelity than that, something that looks and feels realistic. Otherwise, you're going to start getting feedback like, I've seen this on paper prototypes and wireframes. They're like, I really like blue buttons. Can we get some more blue buttons? I love them. And that's not what you're looking for, right? You're looking for validation of an idea. So the last nugget that I'll leave you with is, how do we take those lifelike prototypes and how do we use them? What I would advocate for is putting lifelike prototypes in front of customers, seeing how they use them, looking for those friction points, the slow friction points, and if they're able to accomplish what they need to accomplish. When you find something, iterate, because we're going to try to do this as cheaply as possible. Hopefully in design, you can use stuff like Envision, right, to create something, put it in front of people, see how they use it, before you actually launch it. So you can make mistakes, but you can make mistakes quickly and cheaply. So simulate with people, watch them use it, change it, do it again. And keep doing this until you see people using it and getting really excited about it. When they're able to articulate, hey, this is how this is helping me get something done, that's when you're on the right track. So I feel like there are a million other things I can talk about, but I know I'm limited on time. So I'll leave you on the simulate, iterate loop, and feel free to find me. I'll be around the rest of the day. I'm happy to talk a little bit more.